Welcome back to On Texas Football. I'm Jeff Howe, joined by CJ Vogel. Time for another edition of Longhorn Weekly. This one brought to you by Duck Camp. I want to welcome Duck Camp back as an On Texas Football sponsor for the football season. We'll tell you more about Duck Camp later in the show. Special edition of Longhorn Weekly this week, CJ, because it's all about camp. It starts this week. The march to the Ohio State game, we'll call it the March to Columbus, is afoot. Texas gets started on Wednesday. Tuesday will be coordinator availability. For those unfamiliar with how Texas does things, and this is just Sark's policy, it is what it is. We hear from the coordinators 2 times a year, once in the preseason and then again in the postseason, whether it's bowl availability or CFP or whatever. But, CJ, this is one of those times. So on Tuesday, the media will meet on the 40 acres with Kyle Flood, Pete Kwiatkowski, and Jeff Banks. Not necessarily the place people probably think we'd start. I want to start with Jeff Banks because special teams was maybe the most consistent thing about this program until last year. And I don't even think you could call it average, CJ. It was either helping Texas or it was hurting Texas. It was never just kind of there. But when you look at the portal additions, bringing in Jack Bomeister, bringing in Mason Shipley, we'll see what happens in the return game. But there was a call, CJ, from a decent number of Longhorn fans that were ready to move on from Jeff Banks. I personally think that was throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I'm willing to give Jeff Banks a mulligan for last year, but there's no question, CJ, kicking game has to be a plus. It can't hurt Texas this year if this program wants to get over the hump.
Yeah, I'm 100% with you. And look, special teams, to me, it's always been a relative strength for Steve Sarkisian and his staff and Jeff Banks and his unit, right? That's always been something that they've had up their sleeves. Last year, no debate, took a step back. But even in some of those big moments, right? Let's not forget against Arizona State, you had a blocked field goal right before halftime. You had a punt return for a touchdown. And then you get the uglies, right? The SEC championship game. You get missed field goals out the wazoo. You get a a fake punt converted for a long fourth down that leads to points for Georgia. I mean, it was too inconsistent a year ago, yet you've gone out and you made the changes that you deem worthy, right? You add Mason Shipley, you add all-conference Jack Bomeister. Big thing for me is, what do those gunners look like? What does that chemistry in the punt and return game look like? Is it DeAndre Moore for every return game? Who's going to be the guys that step up in that regard as well? And then also, what have you learned from a year ago if you're Jeff Banks? Is there more attention to detail needed? Is it just simply not having the personnel? That's something that I think is up for debate at the moment. And for me, look, it's tough when you know that your punters aren't going to be able to boom 50 to 55 yards, right? That's a tough thing to ask. But when you're consistently averaging in that 35 to 40 range, well, that puts a significant strain on your defense when you know that you're losing about 10 yards per punt. So that's going to be big for me in 2025 is, what does that punt coverage unit look like? And what does the return game look like, in the sense that, well, very hit or miss with what you saw with Silas Bolden a year ago.
You mentioned it. The Peach Bowl pretty much encapsulated special teams in 2024. The Silas Bolden punt return, Ethan Burke blocks a field goal, but in that same game, you give up a fake punt for a big play, and then Bert Auburn struggles. You just can't have the good with the bad. As long as it's even, it doesn't need to be boom, but it can't be bust. As long as this is not hurting Texas, you're going to be okay. I'm with you on the Gunners, and there's actually a guy we'll talk about. You had a story about guys that are in prove-it mode for camp over on ontexasfootball.com. I think there's one of those guys on your list that I think, if he's bought in, could be a factor in helping your punt coverage. But to your point, CJ, and I've mentioned this pretty much since the end of the season, the Texas defense, as good as it was, and it was elite. It may have been the best defense in the country last year, all things considered. As good as the Longhorns were on defense, they were one of the worst field position defenses in the league, which means the defense is almost constantly defending either short fields or really inadequate fields. They're never having to make opponents defend, 80, 90-yard fields. It's even more amazing what the defense did last year when you consider the fact that between the offense's turnovers and special teams gaffes, at the end of the day, they got not near as much help as they should have in terms of field position.
It's interesting when you look at it that way. You had a championship-level defense. You had an offense that's probably right on the fringe of the college football playoff. And you had a special teams that was maybe bowl like right on the fringe of a bowl eligibility team, right? There were certainly different tiers that each facet of the game played into for the Longhorns a year ago, and yet that defense time after time stood up. Now, what can that defense look like this year, given, hey, a team has to go 80 yards every single drive to put points on the board rather than 45 or 50 or 55, where they were often starting drives in 2024. So, yeah, that special teams unit, especially the punt unit, because I've been a big proponent, every drive that ends with a kick is a good drive offensively. You're not going to score every single drive, but if you can punt the football, if you can kick a field goal, or you obviously kick a PAT, that's a great drive for the offense, especially against your Georgias, against your Ohio States, going on the road against Florida, in which momentum switches are going to be so key. Kicking the football after every possession, that's a big win, and it helps your defense out a ton.
I think that's an old Greg Davisism, CJ. I heard Greg Davis a lot of times back in the day talk about in every drive with a kick. One that I really liked that he said, reserve the right to punt. Hey, a punt is not a bad play. It beats the heck out of a turnover. Let's talk about the Texas defense, though, because we've talked about them. Hey, even though they were backed up and defending short fields and sudden change, you never want a big sample size to figure out if your defense is a really good sudden change defense. You also don't want a big sample size to see, okay, how's our defense at defending short fields? But Texas was elite. They were elite in a lot of areas last year. When we meet with Pete Kwiatkowski on Tuesday, what do you want to hear from him? Because the thing I'm most fascinated by, and it's one of my top 2 or 3 things in camp, and I don't know how much we'll get to see or hear about it, but all of these pass rushers between your edge room and your off-ball linebackers, and what's your grand plan if you're Pete Kwiatkowski? You got the spoon in the cauldron. You're cooking it up in the meeting room. What are you going to do with Brad Spence and Trey Moore, and we'll throw Ethan Burke in there, Colin Simmons, Anthony Hill? When you get all these rushers, CJ, I just want to know how they're going to deploy them and how many different ways they're going to deploy them.
They had 2 names you didn't mention, Zeno Umeozulu and Colton Vasek. Look, I think both of them have the frames certainly necessary for SEC football and the quickness to excel off the edge as well. But then you throw them into that group of linebackers. You throw them next to a Colin Simmons. And quite frankly, how do you get all these guys onto the field? Well, it's the literal definition of cream rises to the top, right? The best of the best will be on the field. And for Texas, well, you're looking at 6, 7, 8 if you add a Lance Jackson or a Justice Terry in that conversation as well. It's without question the deepest part of the Texas roster, and the more ways that they're able to utilize more of those guys that can rush the passer, well, the easier it is for the back end, which we'll talk about having some new faces back there. But that's going to be key because, Jeff, you mentioned ultimate success of that Texas defense a year ago was the sudden change. Looking it up, bcftoys.com, one of my favorite college football data websites. Texas was the number 1 defense in the country a year ago in points per drive defensively. 1.14 points allowed per possession. That's elite. That's what I look at in terms of how good is a given defense, because they'll divvy them up from you have to go 80-plus yards, you got to go 60-plus yards, and then you have a short field, right? Texas elite in all 3 categories, and evidently the number 1 defense in the country in terms of points per possession allowed. Will they be able to replicate that again this year? Well, we'll have to wait and see. That secondary especially is one of those question marks, but when you have as many guys up front that can create havoc plays, it makes life a whole lot easier. And for Pete Kwiatkowski, well, it's like moving with 6 or 7 different queens on the chessboard.
I want to get to some prove it guys on defense because you mentioned Zeno Umeozulu is one of those guys, and he's kind of a forgotten guy. When you look at the depth in the edge room, you know, we're probably not going to see Smith the Robo this year. He's probably bound, and Sark has even said it's more likely than not that he's going to redshirt this year as he continues to recover from the knee injury. But between Zena and Colton Vasek's the guy, CJ, you didn't mention him in the article, but a couple posts down, it was on additional mentions, you threw him in there. Colton Zena's interesting because we knew he was a developmental guy, and maybe now is the time where he's gotten some filled out his frame a little bit, maybe because the pressure's not on him at all because he's got guys in front of him. Maybe in some spot duty he can give you something. But Colton Vasek is one of the more wild card players on this roster for me because when he's been healthy and on the field, he's been really productive. I mean, in terms of per snap production, he's one of your best defenders in the box. The big part of that is when he's on the field. I think, CJ, if his body doesn't let him down, that's just another weapon PK is going to be able to deploy. And you think about the natural rusher that Colton Vasek is already. The other thing is, what is going to be the Allen Clark factor with these edge guys in terms of getting better, developing some pass rush moves? We know the athleticism is there with a lot of guys, but if Colin Simmons, for example, develops a couple of elite moves to go with just his natural guy, I mean, you're talking about a guy that's top 3 in the draft, number 1 draft pick type stuff. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but as far as Colton Vasek goes, are you with me, CJ? I really think if he's just on the field, he's going to be productive.
Yeah, I agree. And again, if he's healthy, if he's ready to go, he's going to give you plus snaps. And I've been on record saying, and I still believe it, if Colton Vasek is healthy, he's your second most natural pass rusher, right? We saw that only in 33 pass rushing snaps a year ago, but 6-7 pressures, 2 sacks, 2 hits, 2 hurries. This was a guy that was around the football often and creating those havoc plays that, you, myself, Rod Babers talk about so often are so crucial to that defensive front 7. The key, of course, with Colton is, and this has been the key every year, can he stay healthy enough to last 10, 12, 15, however many games Texas needs to play in 2025? And the same goes for Zena, right? Because he had that opportunity to get some really valuable snaps with the ones a year ago, right? They had Colin Simmons on a bit of a pitch count. They obviously know how talented he is. And it was time for Zena to step up, but he got dinged up a little bit with the hand. The thumb injury kind of sidelined him for a few practices in the spring. If the 2 of those guys are healthy, they're going to give you some valuable time on the field. And again, I mentioned it. If you're Pete Kwiatkowski, you're dealing with a chessboard full of queens. And how do you maneuver those guys around to make life a living hell for the opposite side?
We haven't even touched on the interior guys. We just mentioned them in terms of name, but we talked about Trey Moore and Brad Spence. And Trey Moore could be up on the line of scrimmage. He could be off the ball. Same with Brad Spence. We haven't even touched on the interior guys, CJ. So if Murad Watson or Alex January, I'm not counting on Cole Brevard to give you a pass rush because that's just not part of his game. And
right.
Maybe Travis Shaw can give you that in spurts. But, if you get any kind of pass rush presence from those guys on the interior, we'll see what Justice Terry's role is, what's Lance Jackson's role going to be. CJ, this could be I'm going out on a limb saying this. This could be the most talented pass rush Texas has had maybe since the late 70s, early 80s, just in terms of the volume of guys across multiple positions they have that can get after the quarterback.
Yeah, there's going to need to be one guy that steps up and becomes that Byron Murphy, that Vernon Broughton from a year ago that creates 2 to 3, maybe 4 sacks from that interior. And look, that's a lot, right? You don't expect those guys pushing 325, 340 pounds to necessarily be a consistent down-to-down pass rushing threat. But if you're able to get that pressure up the middle, and remember what that thing was like against Michael Penix in the Sugar Bowl is, well, the edges are crashing hard, but I'm able to step up and have a lane to either run and take off or a lane to throw up the field. Well, if you have that pressure coming from the middle, it makes life a whole lot more difficult. Is that an Alex January? To me, that's who I have circled on my board saying, there's your interior pass rushing threat this year. And if he's able to pick up a couple sacks this year, that's all the more better for what, again, is going to be a very difficult front 7 to defend against.
Real quick, before we flip over to offense, 2 guys that you have on your Prove It board, again, your story over at ontexasfootball.com, JJR, Jordan Johnson-Rebel, and Xavier Filsaime. When we talk about that safety room, we talk about Michael Taps returning All-America, Derek Williams coming off the injury. Is Jelani McDonald going to be at safety? Is he going to be at nickel? He's going to play both in some way, shape, or form. I think Jalen Gilbo at corner is going to determine a lot of how you can use Jelani McDonald. But in terms of the depth, CJ, Jonah Williams is going to factor into that depth somehow. We assume Zealous Hicks will factor into that depth somehow. I know they're second-year guys, but it really might be now or never for JJR and Xavier Filsaime. If they're going to make a move up the depth chart and kind of plant their flag, so to speak, this might be the time to do it.
I 100% agree. Look, Michael Taft probably gone after this year. Jelani McDonald has a chance to go pro. Who knows with Derek Williams? If he's ready to go after 3 years, he has the opportunity to depart as well. This is the time before you start looking down the road saying, oh, Jonah Williams, we know that this 5-star level talent, dual sport. I don't need to go down the list of accomplishments already for Jonah Williams, but we know that he's going to be a piece that Dwayne Aquina, Mark Orford, that Texas secondary deploy often. So for JJR, for Xavier Filsaime, this is the time where you say, hey, I'm planting my flag. I'm DB number 4. I'm DB number 5. You don't get to get on the field over me, at least not this quickly. So for those two, who's going to be the first off the bench of the two? My bet right now is Jordan Johnson-Rubel. But does that remain the case week 4, week 7, the playoffs, especially as Jonah Williams becomes more acclimated with the calls and schemes?
All right, before we move over to offense, I want to thank our sponsor for this edition of Longhorn Weekly. That's Duck Camp, and we want to welcome Duck Camp back to On Texas Football as a sponsor for the football season. Duck Camp gear is made for the people that live for the moments out there. So where you fish, hunt, anything you do outdoors, especially watching football. If you like to watch football outdoors, everyone's got their man cave set up. Wherever you're doing this football season, make sure you're doing it wearing Duck Camp gear. They like doing all that stuff, so they built a company centered on it, based in Austin and dedicated to giving people the best in class hunting and fishing apparel. There are those of you out there that look forward to the opening day of hunting season and kick off a Longhorn football with all the fervor and excitement of a 5-year-old on Christmas morning. And Duck Camp is here to let you know that from opening day to game day, they've got you covered. Here's to great seasons, hunting and football seasons. Hope everybody enjoys it. Shop duckcamp.com today for all your gear, and welcome back Duck Camp as an On Texas Football sponsor for the 2025 football season. CJ, as we get into the offense, I want to address a note Bobby Burton had over at ontexasfootball.com over the weekend. Matthew Caldwell, Trey Owens, it sounds like it could be a legit competition for QB2. All I'll say is, every year Sark's been here, they've had to go to the backup at some point. Doesn't matter who it is. I just like the fact that apparently heading into camp, that's a legit competition, because law of averages tells you that backup is probably going to be needed at some point in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and look, going out and adding a guy with valuable playing time is not something to brush over. And I know that there's high expectations for a Trey Owens. Shoot, there are high expectations for a KJ Lacey. But neither of them have seen meaningful snaps in which they've had to go put points on the board. For Caldwell, a guy who's had a number of starts already in his career, well, that's a guy that's gone out, executed a game plan, understood defenses and the changes that they make mid-game. For Texas, if his number's called, there's a guy who's been there and done that sort of say. That's something that is certainly valuable at the quarterback position and something that only he provides at the moment.
We'll meet with Kyle Flood on Tuesday, and you've got 3 guys in Kyle Flood's room that are in your prove it category. And I think all 3 of these guys, CJ, could end up playing massive roles this year if they're ready to make that jump. Daniel Cruz, Nate Kibble, and Nick Brooks. With Daniel Cruz, you're talking about a guy, could he challenge for that backup center role to Connor Robertson? Nate Kibble probably has the inside track right now to be your number 3 guard. And keep in mind, last year, even with Hayden Connor and DJ Campbell starting, Cole Hudson played a lot. So the number 3 guard is going to get some run. And then Nick Brooks, is he ready as a true freshman to your number 3 tackle, CJ? I think that's 3 guys that, again, they're young, but those guys are going to be needed this year. You can't count on being as healthy as Texas has been on the offensive line in the last few years. They've been really fortunate in terms of injuries. But those 3 guys, if you do dip into your depth, those guys need to be a part of it.
Yeah, I haven't really put much thought into whether Kyle Flood will deploy that guard rotation again in 2025, but it would make sense, right? Sarkisian's been on record a number of times this fall or this offseason saying, hey, look, we got to get our guys that are deeper down on the depth chart more run, right? This is a long season. If their number is called week 12 or against Texas A&M or in the college football playoff, we're going to need these guys to be up to speed, right? They're going to have to know what it's like when the bullets are flying in live time. So part of me is now thinking, okay, maybe we'll see that platoon of Nate Kibble being thrust into a drive or 2 for DJ Campbell, or on the opposite side for a Nato Umeozulu. Not only does it push that competition, but it gets those younger guys more and more quality reps. On top of that, could a Daniel Cruz push for a Cole Hudson, right? Or where does Connor Robertson fit into this? All I know is, look, Texas really likes Daniel Cruz. They like Nate Kibble. And obviously all the returns that we've heard about big Nate Brooks, well, that's pretty darn impressive as well. So on top of that, Andre Kojo, Jaden Chapman, how do they factor into this conversation as well? But those 3 for me, Nick Brooks, Daniel Cruz, Nate Kibble. Let's see where they go with that 8-man rotation to start the year.
Whenever we get Kyle Flood, I always like talking about the offensive line with him, because when we get Sark's going to obviously have your quarterback questions, your passing game questions, your schematic questions answered. But for Kyle Flood, CJ, what do they feel like? Is there something that they came out of spring ball feeling like they could hang their hat on in the run game? Because I've gone on record, and I'll go on record again, whatever they do, whether they want to be an inside zone team, an outside zone team, more gap power, I just hope they let it evolve organically and don't just go into this thing wanting to be something and it ends up being they're really just smashing their head against the wall trying to get it done. I don't think this staff is that stubborn, but whatever they're going to be in the run game, I just hope it develops organically.
You should be more athletic up front, right? I think a Nato Uzulu has a quicker first step than a Hayden Connor. I think that Cole Hudson, having played in triple option offense back at Frisco High, has a little bit more tenacity in that run game than a Jake Majors. Of course, he'll have about 5 pounds on him as well. So you're a little bit bigger. We've talked about DJ Campbell being in his overall best shape of his Texas career. And of course, 5-star Brandon Baker out on the right side. And look, we go all day about Trevor Gooseby and that athleticism at left tackle. But look, in the run game, you should be a little bit more athletic across the board. But does that equal bigger running lanes? That, to me, is the big question. You could talk about camaraderie. You could talk about how well they gel together. But until I go out there and I see these guys moving bodies, it's going to be a work in progress for me. I don't think that they moved enough bodies in the spring that they would have liked to, especially with kind of the ins and outs of that interior defensive line that they faced on a given down. So for fall camp, look, it's not just a prove-it year for the guys behind them, but it's a prove-it year for these starting 5, you got to come out swinging because there are guys ready to take your job immediately.
You mentioned somebody else, too, in your prove-it piece, Spencer Shannon, and he's kind of offensive line adjacent because he is the inline guy. There's a role for him, CJ, because I don't know that there's anybody on this offensive line. Maybe in a pinch, if you really wanted to use a 6-0 line package, maybe you could put Jaden Chapman out there. Mm-hmm. But Spencer Shannon has a chance to claim a role on this team. If he doesn't, you got to think Jordan Washington and Nick Townsend and I know Emory Winston's a little bit different, but those 2 guys in particular got to be chomping at the bit to get their role to move up the depth chart. So if Spencer Shannon's ready to take a step, there's a role for him on this team.
Yeah, 100%. Look, Jack Gentry's probably that top guy, right? The way that Texas went out, added him, his production speaks for itself. And then it's Spencer Shannon, it's Jordan Washington, and now it's the emergence of Nick Townsend for that 12th personnel. You mentioned Amari Winston, but again, at 6'2"-ish, 240 pounds, that doesn't necessarily prove to be one of those inline guys that can go chip on a 280-pound end or an interior guy. So point being, one of those 3 really has to take that next step. And for Spencer Shannon, a guy who's been around the block more than anybody on this roster or in that room, you certainly have or should have the inside edge. But do you have that physicality that is desired from a Jeff Banks tight end? That's going to be something that I think is really interesting because we could go again all day about that physical football player mentality for Nick Townsend and the way that we expect him to be an impact guy early on.
We started talking about Jeff Banks, and we're ending it talking about Jeff Banks because that tight end lab that he's got in his room, whether it's been Jatavian Sanders or Gunnar Helm, even Juan Davis, guys that have been in his room for multiple years, we see development, and they leave Texas infinitely better players than when they got there. And in the case of Jatavian Sanders and Gunnar Helm, they left as pretty close to complete tight ends when they were not that coming in. So if Spencer Shannon took to the development, he can give Texas something again as a true inline tight end. I'll end with this, CJ. Speaking of Jeff Banks and special teams, the one guy we haven't talked about on your prove it list is Aaron Butler. Yeah. And I think for Aaron Butler and Ryan Niblett both, we might get more questions whenever we're doing a live stream here on the channel. We might get more questions about those 2 guys than anybody. And I think if there are roles where those 2 guys can help this team win football games, I think with their speed, if they buy into being gunners on the punt team and the physicality is there, or even covering kicks on the kickoff team, CJ, they're athletic enough to help Texas win ball games if they're bought in and they can take both those roles. And you talked about at the start, don't discount the role gunners play because you go back to 2023, Texas might have had the best duo in the country with Keelan Robinson and Keaton Crawford. 2 guys, by the way, that ended up getting drafted. They were NFL draft picks, and both were primarily special teams players. So don't discount what Aaron Butler and or Ryan Niblett could mean for this team on special teams.
Yeah, I'll keep this one short. Look, I think it's the easiest way. Special teams, gunner, kickoff return, whatever it is. Easiest way to earn the trust of your coaching staff. If you go out there and consistently do the job that you're asked to, and maybe you go above and beyond, right? Trey Wisner against Baylor, 2023, goes out there, true freshman, several big-time hits. Jelani McDonald in that same game, you're sitting there saying, okay, these guys, they're showing me something. What more can they show me if I put them in different situations? Evidently, they're good football players wherever you put them in, but it starts in that special teams unit. For Aaron Butler, look, let's be a little bit honest here. He's got a ways to go to crack that rotation, right? It was Dalen McCutcheon who came in 2 months and was immediately working with that first team when DeAndre Moore went down. So for me, if I'm Aaron Butler at the moment, I'm looking at special teams either as a gunner, a kickoff return specialist, someone in that kickoff team. That's the easiest way. The quickest way that I can get on the field is by earning the trust and standing out amongst the rest of those guys in the Special Forces unit. So that's going to be interesting to watch as well, on top of where does a Ryan Niblett start? Does he become a guy that you could throw on either side of the ball? I know that he's kind of bounced back and forth from wide receiver to DB. We believe that he's back on the offensive side of the ball. So if that's something that's going to be a tip to him, is that versatility. Special teams, again, is going to be a place where he can really make his impact felt early on.
Don't forget, too, a couple starters on defense. Leonga Lafau, Manny Muhammad also cut their teeth on teams, and those guys are really big pieces of this team now. So it is a path to the field, kids, believe it or not, starting out on special teams. CJ, thank you for the knowledge and expertise as always. Thank you to Matthew behind the scenes for producing it. Thank you to Duck Camp for sponsoring this edition of Longhorn Weekly. If you are not a member over at ontexasfootball.com, if you're not an OTFOG, that's all right. You can become one right now. Get over to the site, sign up with the promo code OTFOG. That'll get you 1 year of access at ontexasfootball.com for $39.95. Look, this is it. This is what we've all been waiting for right now. Camp is here. The preseason is here. We're through summer recruiting, more recruiting to come. We are getting into the meat and potatoes of actual football, and we'll have it all for you over at ontexasfootball.com. Again, if you're not a member, sign up using the promo code OTFOG. That'll get you 1 year of access for $39.95. Also, don't forget to like this video. Make sure you're subscribed to the On Texas Football YouTube channel. That way, you're kept abreast of everything going on the 40 acres, no matter whether it's here on the channel or over on the website. You will be up to date with all the news, notes, and nuggets coming out of Longhorn Camp. For Matthew, for the entire On Texas Football staff, for CJ Vogel, I'm Jeff Howe. Thank you so much for watching and listening, and until next time, hook 'em.